Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for our third session in our new series, ABC of Marxism. With Ian Spencer tonight, we're going to look at the question of towards a theory of revolution. That's how Marx and Engels came to develop a theory of revolution. Hi, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. What I'm going to try to do is show how, in particular, Marx and Engels, in their critique of Hegel, arrived at the position of being communists, and more importantly, then how revolution was conceived in terms of not just simply the state, for example, taking hold of the means of production, but the proletariat as a whole taking hold of the means of production. And more importantly, that it wasn't just simply about the mode of production that was at stake, but what was at stake was what it is to be a human being, the essence of what it is to be a human being. There was something of a mythology created in the 1960s and 70s that there's no such thing as human nature, and there is only, if you like, historically specific human nature. People who hold such a view are entitled to any view they want, but that wasn't Marx and Engels' view. Marx and Engels clearly had a conception of human nature, and it was deeply rooted in an understanding of the way in which capitalism separates what it is to be truly human from humans as they are in this given historical epoch. Um, so, without further ado, uh, I've mentioned in the past these notable works from regarded as early works, but they also represent the maturation of what we've come to know as Marx and Engels' system, as it were, the notion of dialectical materialism, although the term dialectical materialism or historical materialism wasn't used by Marx and Engels at all. And it's something that became a feature of the interpretation of Marx and Engels through the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. However, the German-French yearbook, which was intended to be a periodical, but only saw one edition before it was suppressed, included both an introduction to a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. It was Engels and not Marx who really began the critique of political economy. But Marx, seeing the importance of Engels' writing, not only published his essay, but then took up the task of extending that contribution to the critique of political economy. And of course, the ultimate outcome of that was Das Kapital, of which, of course, only the first volume was written for publication. Also in the same yearbook was Marx's critique of Bruno Bauer on the Jewish question. And what I'm going to argue is that dialectics runs through all of these, and moreover, runs through the conceptualization of the way in which humans are exploited, the very nature of capitalism. And we see also later on in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, sometimes known as the Paris manuscripts of 1844, Marx's probably clearest discussion around human alienation, the separation of what it is to be truly human. And finally, of course, the German ideology written in 1845-6. And neither of the last two works were published. And the German ideology, of course, was famously consigned to the gnawing criticism of the mice. A critique of both, an extension of their critique of Bruno Bauer, also of Ludwig Feuerbach, and the anarchist Max Stirner. The chapter on Stirner is not often read, but it's an interesting one because, of course, Max Stirner, his particular strand of anarchism was the idea of the absolute rights of the individual. And what Marx was arguing, as he does elsewhere, is the notion around the rights of the individual as something which is rooted in bourgeois jurisprudence, which is a feature of capitalism. It is not the basis for human emancipation, is not the basis for the realization of what it is to be truly human. Famously, in the introduction to the contribution of the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, we see Marx talking about the way in which religion, as it were, is an expression of the alienated human form, and rather than talking about um, rather than talking about the includes the famous phrase around religion as the opium of the people, something which is often misunderstood as somehow being to do with narcotics. In fact, it was concerned instead with the idea that in order to change society, for religion to not be a feature of human society, you have to change the nature of the society which gives rise for the need for religion. And that was an important point. So Marx, instead of portraying Marx as some kind of militant atheist, he was someone who understood the position of religion as ideology in society. And of course, this was not unimportant either when he's just in his discussion of the Jewish question. Bruno Bauer famously was arguing that in order for the Jewish population of Germany to be liberated, what they should do is stop being Jewish. Marx, by contrast, argued that for the condition of the Jewish population, it's not a question of Jewish people having to give up being Jewish. It's a question of society having to change in such a way as that Judaism isn't the expression of capitalist relations of production. So therefore, but the other point that's interesting and important in the Jewish question is that it's one of the first areas where it was published, where Marx has a discussion around the twofold nature of what it is to be a human. Twofold in the sense that a human being is a living organism, but also has a kind of juridical status as a citizen, the possessor, the bearer of rights, the bearer of possessory right. And this twofold nature is, of course, something which is crucial for the understanding of what we'll look at now, which is the relationship between philosophy and political economy. Political economy, of course, is, if you like, the philosophy of economics. It asks the most fundamental questions. Marx starts off volume 1 of Capital. I appreciate I'm skipping forward a little bit here in talking about Capital, but I just want to point out that the first two parts of Capital are what is a commodity, and then goes on to ask the question, what is money? And so before I go on to talk about how there's a relationship between the twofold nature of what it is to be a human, the citizen, and the natural organism, as it were, it's worth asking the question, what is a commodity? For Marx, a commodity has to be a useful thing. We leave aside, whether people have ever bought a pet rock or a Taylor Swift album or whatever else, but it has to be something which is useful, which satisfies a human need, and also embodies exchange value. And it's again this twofold nature, which is a crucial aspect, which we see as an expression of their deeply rooted understanding of Hegel's dialectics. So a commodity. We could also add to this, by the way, that nature plays an important role. We human beings are part of nature, and of course, in creating means of production, we are appropriating nature. So it's a mistake to believe that Marx and Engels just thought there was just use value and exchange value. They were fully appreciative of the fact that nature plays an important part here. So to take something like my watch that I can see here in front of me, it is a useful thing. I can tell the time with it, but it embodies a certain amount of exchange value as well. It cost about 20 quid from Argos or something, and whether that's whether you're looking at a Rolex or whether you're looking at a pair of spectacles or a pair of shoes or an Art Deco building, as we see here, the Hoover Building, opened in 1933 in Perivale in London. Their exchange value is on the basis of labour. We're dealing here with a labour theory of value, as we discussed when looking at Adam Smith and David Ricardo in Marx and Engels' critique of them. So in looking at the development of use value and exchange value, Marx talks about concrete labor and abstract labor. And the importance of this is that on the one hand, we see concrete individual labors, being a tailor, being a blacksmith, being a computer scientist, being a doctor or whatever else, individual concrete labors, but also constitute part of an abstract social labor. All workers' outputs, whether they're a barrister or a barista, are part of that abstract social labor. And it is, from Marx's point of view, it is not that a thing is determined just by the amount of labor in a particular object. It's an adequate part of socially necessary labor time to make the product. And this is important because one of the objections that you could raise against the labor theory of value is, well, look, if I'm a pretty poor carpenter, which I am, it's going to take me a lot longer to make a table that won't be as good as a well-time served craftsman who can produce 2 or 3 tables in the course of a week. So surely, though, because my table embodies more labor, it's worth more. And yet it's a worse table because I'm not really good at making tables. But that's not what Marx is arguing. Marx is arguing that for any given production of any given commodity, it is the socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce the work. And it is, in a sense, so when he uses the term, it may be a feature of the translation, but an adequate part of socially necessary labor time is a proportion of the socially necessary labor time required to make that particular object, that particular commodity, under whatever social conditions. So, for example, if there is highly developed technology, machinery, and so on, that has a crucial impact upon the value of that commodity. So if we were looking at commodities, there is some letters in front of you. For those who, like me, become absolutely horrified if you see equations, don't be alarmed. It's very simple. The simple circulation of commodities here, we see C representing a commodity, M representing money, and M and C prime representing a different commodity. This we can talk about as the simple circulation of commodities. So imagine I make a table and I take it to the marketplace and I sell the table, and then I use the money from selling the table to buy some cheese to go and eat. So I start with a commodity, I end with a different commodity. There's no point me selling a table to go and buy an identical table. There would be it would just be a waste of time and effort. So here we're looking at either sort of artisan production or and it's a stylized form of the simple circulation of a commodity which bears value. The important thing here is that value, of course, often seems to be a natural feature of the object, rather like its weight or its height or its dimensions or its color. What Marx is arguing is that the fact that it has value is the result of a social relationship. But the simple circulation of commodities is really a differentiation in qualitative terms. I start with a table, I end up with cheese. They've been exchanged for a certain amount of money. Certainly, a table I made wouldn't be worth much more than a piece of cheese. But there we go. It's something which differs only qualitatively, and it ends there. That simple circulation ends with the exchange of one commodity for another through the medium of money. And the analogous position that most people find themselves in with their one marketable commodity, labor power, which is here designated as L, you sell your labor power to get money to buy commodities, whether that's cheese, tables, cars, stereos, or machetes with which to do the bossing. Any one of those things would be a commodity. So a worker just sells their one marketable commodity, their labor power. Now, why labor power? Why not labor? Because actually, if you look at some early formulations by Marx, for example, in The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx doesn't draw that distinction quite so clearly. He talks about labor. Labor power is, if you like, a commodity which, once it is put to work, as it were, yields labor. So, for example, if you go and buy a car, you buy a car. You don't buy transport. You buy potential transport. Um, you buy a car which, when it's used, yields transport. Um, and similarly, when the capitalist buys labor power and sets the worker to work, what that then yields is labor. Now, of course, if you go and buy a car, some cars will yield more transport than others. If you had the great good fortune to buy a Lada or something like that, then it's not going to yield a great deal of transport. If you buy a Mercedes-Benz, it's going to yield many years of service or whatever. And the value of that will often be expressed in terms of its price. Price and values are not identical in Marx's writings, but I won't be dwelling upon that today. So what the capitalist buys is labor power, a commodity which, when it's used, yields labor. And the interesting thing about labor power, of course, it's the only commodity which really yields more value than it costs to reproduce it. So let's compare that with the circulation of capital. The capitalist starts with money. He buys commodities, which can be labor power and means of production, so raw materials, land, factories to put their production in, and so on. And then, having worked upon those commodities, sells it for more money. And here we have not a qualitative relationship, but a quantitative one. The capitalist starts off with money and ends up with more money by the sale of the commodities. And note a distinctive feature of that it's a potentially infinite process. So we start with money, we end up with the commodity, we sell it for more money, which we can use to buy more commodities, which we can sell for more money, and so on. You can see this, for example, in mercantile capital. The merchant invests money to, say, buy a ship, to go to the East Indies, to buy spices, and bring them back and sell them for more money than it costs to. And of course, there was a whole school of political economists, the mercantilists, who held that was truly productive value. So, importing spices from the East Indies for huge sums of money certainly yielded a great deal of finance into the pockets of merchants, and of course also through taxation the exchequer. But that's a particular circulation of capital. The circulation of industrial capital, though, is distinctive by having the commodity that's bought is both means of production, raw materials and so on, and labor power. Now, so the capitalist comes into the market with a sum of money, hires workers, hires tools and machinery, or buys tools and machinery, sets them to work, and produces a commodity which produces more money. And what we'll see here is that then is the origins of profits. So far, so obvious, perhaps. The thing about it is, of course, it isn't necessarily obvious. And what we see, even when you look at the contemporary labour movement, and you still hear rubbish like a fair day's work for a fair day's pay and that kind of thing, what it overlooks is the fact that despite the superficial appearance of this being a contract freely entered into, what you actually have here is the basis of exploitation. And not only exploitation, but exploitation which appears to be opaque. It does not appear to be exploitation in the way, for example, that feudalism does. In a feudal society, if you don't go and work on the Lord's land, he'll come and cut your head off, or have you flogged, or whatever else, where the extraction of a surplus is obvious and by the threat of violence. Here, the extraction of the surplus is through the contract, something which is supposedly freely entered into, but most workers, of course, don't have any other choice but to sell their labour power. Again, after discussing the commodity in Das Kapital, Marx goes on to talk about money. And it's important to really understand the essence of money, not just the superficial appearance of things. Marx is very critical of the fact that economists of the time would talk about money just simply in functionalist terms. That is to say, we use money because it's easier to give change in coin rather than half a sheep or £2 of butter or whatever. Here's your change. So quite often, any kind of discussion of money is around its functional usefulness. Money is what money does. But for Marx, he was interested in the essential nature of money. He wanted to understand and demonstrate what this mysterious thing is. The reason why I've put two types of money on the slide here, the 1914 half sovereign is, of course, made of gold of a certain level of purity. The money underneath the euros are, as it were, fiat money. That is to say, money in token money. What Marx is arguing here is that the something like gold can stand outside normal kind of exchange relations. Although gold has some use value, and if you recall when we were talking about the classical political economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Smith talks about the water and diamonds paradox, where diamonds have no real use value, except obviously in jewelry and for certain types of cutting, because they're very hard. But broadly speaking, have no real value in use, but have a great deal of value in exchange. And that's because, of course, it takes a lot of labor to secure a diamond. Ricardo uses the gold and water paradox in the same way. Water, of course, is freely abundant, especially at the moment. And of course, what you see is, for example, in gold coinage, the gold as a material is particularly suitable for its use as money. It's very easily to be divided. It can be molded into preset shapes which prevent clipping and the debasement of the coinage. And of course, it has an inherent value because of the amount of labor required to secure it. It's scarce, and therefore it's not like pebbles on a beach, which if they were a currency, we would just go and take as much as you wanted, and it wouldn't serve any useful purpose. So to think about why you need to understand the essence of money, you can't just say, for example, to understand what a ladder is, just to simply say it's something that helps you climb up against a wall. But if you said, for example, it's two long poles connected by slats that are strong enough to hold human weight, then you start to approximate what a ladder actually is, rather than just simply the idea that it's something to climb up the wall. And here, so the value of the gold is like any other commodity, determined by an adequate part of socially necessary labor time necessary to secure the gold, and that therefore can stand aside from other commodities as a universal equivalent to other commodities. And so it's not just explicable by its function, it's a universal equivalent. And the fact that subsequently, so since 1971, for example, in the USA, after with the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the idea that there is no now exchangeability of dollars for gold. Of course, you can simply go and buy gold coins, and you can buy, but there's no gold backing to the dollar anymore after 1971. But that doesn't mean to say that money doesn't exist, and it might well be fiat money. And of course, actually, even the plastic banknotes and coins that you see in your pocket, not only do they not have any inherent value, it is a symbolic value, but of course, fiat money has developed further since. So when you go and take out a £50,000 loan for a car, you're not actually relying on somebody to deposit £50,000 in the bank before they can make £50,000 available to you. It's just numbers. It's just numbers on a spreadsheet, and that money is transferred to you. Therefore, the banks are actually creating fiat money for for example, loans. And this, of course, is one of the causes of financial instability. But it also, of course, allows a huge expansion of the ability for investment. Um, so let's have a look at exploitation as an objective relationship to the means of production. Marx starts off with an assumption, as it were, but a perfectly reasonable one, that there is an exchange of equivalents. If there's an exchange of equivalents, where do profits come from? See, he was engaged, as we'll see more later, in debates around philosophy, with Proudhon, for example. Proudhon's book, What is Property, famously contains the line, property is theft. Marx was at pains to point out that this isn't true. This doesn't tell us very much. It might be a nice little rhetorical flourish for Proudhon to simply say that rich people are rich because they have stolen something from us. But what Marx is keen to point out is that actually all the rules of capitalist jurisprudence, all the rules of bourgeois jurisprudence are being obeyed. The worker sells their labor power, usually at, and sometimes above and sometimes below its value. And that the things that determine the value of that labor power are what it takes to reproduce the worker. And that's on the basis of the historical context in which that sale is taking place. So if that just involves bare subsistence, food, water, some kind of rudimentary shelter, that's one thing. But it can, as we'll go on to see, include things like, well, a university education, or an expectation of an annual foreign holiday, or high-cost consumer durables, or whatever else. So what determines the value of a commodity, whether it's a watch or a car, is an adequate part of socially necessary labor time to produce that commodity. And the same goes for labor power. What's different is that labor power can yield more value than it costs to reproduce it. And so exploitation, therefore, is an objective relationship. You don't have to even feel exploited to be exploited. Moreover, as we'll see, you can even be more exploited than somebody who's working in a sweatshop somewhere and earning just enough to keep body and soul together. And at the same time, you can see a rising rate of exploitation and rising real wages. And that's an important transformation compared to when Marx was writing in the 19th century. But he was fully aware of it, and he was fully aware of it as a developing trend. So let's just take, for example, our little line here of ABC, where it's an 8-hour working day. We'll just pretend it's 8 hours. It could be 10, it could be 12, whatever. But we'll say it's an 8-hour working day, and it's these people here producing garments. Now let's imagine in the line between A and B is 4 hours. So we have 4 hours, and in that 4 hours, they've produced enough garments to equal what they get paid. That's their necessary labor time. So in 4 hours, they sell enough, make enough shirts or trousers or whatever they're making to be equal to their wages. So you might say, well, the workers should just say, well, I'm off now then. I've made enough to equal my wages. I'll have my money and I'll go. No. The capitalist says, I've bought your labor power for 8 hours, not for 4. I've bought it for 8. So the fact that you've made enough to equal your wages in 4 hours is neither here nor there. Our contract is for 8 hours, so you'll carry on. And that remaining 4 hours is surplus labor, and the basis, therefore, of surplus value. And what we see then is a rate of exploitation of 100%. And of course, in some cases, the amount of commodities produced by the worker might take 6 hours in an 8-hour day, or even 9 hours in a 12-hour day, and so on. But the rate of exploitation, where it's just half and half, you can see as an exploitation of 100%. Now, of course, the capitalist can increase the amount of uh, of surplus labor by simply increasing the working day, which is referred to as absolute surplus value. So instead of so the worker still makes enough garments in 4 hours to equal their wages, but the capitalist says, well, hang on a minute, I've employed you for 10 hours, so you'll crack on and carry on making garments. And so you see an extension of the working day, absolute surplus value, and an increased rate of exploitation. But something else can happen. That is, the value of labor power can fall. And the value of labor power can fall if the costs of things in the things that workers buy falls. And we see this all the time. Clothes today are now so cheap that you know people can just sort of go and buy something and throw it away, more or less. Compared to, I mean, I don't know anybody today who, for example, darns socks or something. It's not worth their while. So goods that workers have to buy, whether that's socks or whether that's food, if that becomes cheaper, the value of the labor power falls. And from that point of view, you can have a situation where the working day, as in the case at the bottom, where the gap between A and B is narrower. So the worker makes enough in 2 hours, for example, to be equal to their wages. But therefore the rate of exploitation is increased, but without increasing the working day. And of course, you can even get some kind of combination thereof, where you can get an extended working day and reduced cost of producing labor power. But you can also get a situation where you can get real rising wages. So let's imagine it only now takes 2 hours to produce enough garments to equal the wage, but the worker say you're making good profits now. How about we get a pay rise? Okay, we'll give you a pay rise. And what you see is that although they've had a pay rise, they're still being exploited more because the cost of buying products to feed the family of the worker, or to reproduce the working class as a whole, in society, has become cheaper. And this we can talk about as relative surplus value. So you can get rising real wages and rising rate of exploitation. And of course, this also takes place on an international scale. And therefore, what we can see is groups of workers become relatively affluent compared to other groups of workers. So coming back to this idea of the idea of the twofold nature of the individual, what we also see is the twofold nature of the commodity. Abstract labor is what produces exchange value. Concrete labors, if you like, produce use values. But of course, no commodity is just a use value produced by concrete labor, unless you're living in a society which is outside capitalist relations of production. Under normal circumstances, every commodity has to have both use value and exchange value. And although it's the product of individual concrete labors, it's abstract labor overall, a proportion of social labor time that is responsible for creating the exchange value of commodities, and these then exchange in the marketplace. And so therefore, value is determined by socially necessary labor time, and all human labor becomes commensurable with all others. And we could digress a little bit here and say, well, isn't it interesting that what we see here is the development of citizens with equal rights? Citizens with equal rights because we are all commensurable with one another. Notions around universalism, therefore, are thrown up by capitalist relations of production. And we also see, as a consequence of abstract labor, what Marx talks about as the commodity fetishism. So it appears to be a natural feature of a commodity that it has value, rather than it being a social relationship rooted in the exploitation of labor based upon the fact that workers have nothing else to sell but their labor power. Poverty then becomes a necessary feature for the existence of wealth. And that's crucial, because what you tend to see, particularly if you study bourgeois sociology, is you'll hear, we'll talk next week a bit more about the nature of class. In bourgeois sociology, class will be defined, for example, in terms of the amount of status one has, or whether you drive a Kia Picanto or a Mercedes Benz or whatever else. And class, from the point of view of bourgeois sociology, is seen in subjective terms. Whereas for Marx, it's an objective relationship to the means of production. The worker, unless you have a whole class of people with nothing else to sell but their labour power, there is no means by which you can exploit them. And therefore, in capitalist relations of production, a capitalist class, the wealth is created entirely by the proletariat, and moreover, without the proletariat, the bourgeoisie cannot exist. And similarly, without the appropriation of all the wealth by the bourgeoisie, the proletariat ceases to be a proletariat. This is the point about, of course, the proletariat being a universal class. The liberation of the proletariat is the liberation of all humanity. So instead of commodities, so in other words, you could have a society which produces kidney machines or whatever else, not as commodities, but solely as use values. The fact that they have this twofold character of exchange value and use value is a feature of capitalist relations of production. And the notion around reification is the idea of precisely that, the idea that this is somehow a natural feature, and it seems as if it could never possibly be transcended, and as if it had only ever been that way. As we talked about when we looked at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the tendency on the part of bourgeois historians is to see feudalism as kind of immature capitalism. The point is, for Marx, this is a complete transformation from one mode of production to another, and happened by revolutionary means, and will be transformed subsequently. It would be very odd indeed if capitalism were the last mode of production imaginable, and the last mode of production that could not be possibly transcended. There are, of course, other possibilities. So the world could come to an end. Capitalism could be so entrenched it could destroy the natural environment and kill us all before there's any opportunity for transformation. But nevertheless, in principle, as capitalism has come into being by revolutionary means, it will be transcended by revolutionary means. And I just wanted then to move on to the question around human alienation. And from the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, just to try and bring this together in terms of, you see the interrelationship between philosophy and political economy. Just this quote, the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. The more his production increases in power and size, the worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. The devaluation of the world of men is in direct proportion to their increasing value of the world of things. Labour produces not only commodities, it produces itself, the worker as a commodity, and this at the same rate at which it produces commodities in general. This fact expresses merely that the object which labour produces, labour's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labour is labour which has been embodied in an object, which has become material. It is the objectification of labour. Labour's realisation is its objectification. Under these economic conditions, this realisation of labour appears as the loss of realisation for the workers, objectification as loss of the object and bondage to it, appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. Marx then isn't just talking about the transition from one mode of production to another. He's talking about what it is to become truly human for the first time in history. So the worker is alienated from their product, which confronts them as something alien. The worker is alienated from their own activity. There are lots of things lots of people would rather be doing than going to work. You see a separation between mental and manual activity. So instead of doing something creative, producing a whole object from beginning to end, you simply involved in a meaningless piece of detailed division of labor. And above all, this idea of a separation from one's species being. Humanity's species activity, Marx argues, is free creative activity. Yes, bees make hives and honey and ants build nests and so on, but they do so through instinct. Instead, humans alone can build things in their minds in advance of actually making the thing. And moreover, to do so outside of the compulsion to because you have to kill to eat or grow something very quickly to eat or gather berries or whatever. Instead, free creative activity is what it is humanity's species activity. And the other aspect of alienation, of course, is that people are alienated from one another. Workers have to compete with one another, and all mediation is through the contract. Even the most intimate relations are through the contract. Marriage, for example, is little more than a property contract between two people. One of the reasons, incidentally, why Friedrich Engels and Mary Burns never married at all. They had no regard for marriage as a bourgeois property contract. In a socialist society, then, in a communist society, use the terms interchangeably, human relations become direct and personal rather than contractual. The separation of humans is a presupposition for entering into contractual relations. And that is why then in the theses on Feuerbach, of course, which is emblazoned, the last of which, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, is emblazoned on Marx's grave. So thesis 10, the standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint of the new is human society or social humanity. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Could you stop sharing, please?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, comrade. If anybody has a question or would like to make a contribution, please click raise hand at the bottom of your screen and I can make you into a panelist. Are you managing to stop the sharing? Or shall I just take away permission from you if I can do that still? Hold on a second. Okay. There you go.
That's it.
I've taken away your right as a human being. Thank you very much, comrade. Okay, before I bring in some comrades, there's always some questions and perhaps some issues that we can discuss further. I mean, you again, I think, succeeded very well in bringing together philosophical, political, economic issues and describing how they all fit in the theory and practice of Marx and Engels. You started with looking at a twofold nature of human beings and also the role of religion, which I think is actually very interesting and deserves a closer look, because a lot of people think that, the famous quote, religion is opium of the people, is in the same sense as Richard Dawkins, the God delusion. Religion is rubbish. Don't you get it? Here, I explain to you, clearly the world wasn't invented in 7 days. Are you all stupid? Is basically how he argues. And a lot of atheists will argue like that. But I mean, you touched on that, but I do think it's worth talking about a bit more. He explained much more, didn't it? That it is not just about explaining why religion exists and how to overcome it. I mean, there's a really good quote, actually, the full quote, which I can read out a little bit quickly, because it really explains where they came from. The quote starts: "Religion is the opium of the people. It is the sigh of the oppressed." of the world and of our soulless conditions, explaining why people turn to religion, why people have turned to religion. They are totally alienated, which brings us back, okay, of course, to your last point, talking about alienation. And I'm sorry, I know my internet is a bit unstable. Apologies about that. But could you describe this a bit more? How they viewed religion? I mean, they weren't in favor, for example, of simply abolishing all the churches or something, or as some of the has been done in the name of Marx and Engels, have they?
No, I don't see, you don't see anywhere where Marx is simply arguing that religion should just be abolished or whatever. He accepts that it's an expression of an alienated consciousness. The more we attribute to God, the less we understand of ourselves, as it were. So from that point of view, I mean, when you listen to a piece of beautiful spiritual music or whatever else, you're listening to something which is truly human. I mean, a dedicated study of the Bible reveals not a document which is historical in the sense that there was a historical moment when there was Noah's flood, but a whole series of ways to understand the nature of the world in spiritual terms. From that point of view, in alienated terms, but to understand it, it has a history, and and that's the crucial part of it. From that point, so you don't ever see Marx dismissing religion or regarding it as absurd. In fact, as an alienated expression of a yearning for a better world.
And an explanation, I think. I mean, under primitive communism, you also had people not turning to God, but a lot more like nature, the sun god or the moon, etc. Trying to, I mean, it is an external expression of humanity understanding, that there is more to us than just us as we exist, but there's a moon and a sun, and how do we make sense of that? In that sense, religion has a tradition in more nature-like. To understand what's going on around you, not just an escape, but also to explain what's going on around us.
And even in that, of course, I mean, part of the human essence, from Marx's point of view, is that humanity works upon nature to meet its needs, and in so doing, changes both nature and ourselves. And of course, the Urkommunismus, the primitive communism, so-called societies which will pray to the stars or to the beasts of the field or whatever else, are doing something which is inherently human. That is to say, it's an attempt to change nature to meet our needs. So, for example, the religion that regards a particular animal as one which one shouldn't kill is probably because it's worth more as a beast of burden or as something to pull a plough than it ever would be if you just ate it.
Yeah. Like big game, I mean, that was a thing, isn't it? Big game dying out, actually, that led to an end of the Urkommunismus. That's the end of the arrival of scarcity and the arrival of class society, actually. So the big what they called in Indians, the big buffalo and stuff, they were all kind of sacred because they actually fed people for a long time. I also think you succeeded very well in the explaining profit, which is, is still a tricky one for lots of people to understand. And I think you did it really well with the talking about the socially necessary labor time, how a bad carpenter and a good carpenter, and would it be correct to say that socially necessary labor time is something like the average? It averages out throughout society. Is that one way to think about it?
Yeah, the best way of thinking about it, I think, is that we all contribute to, if you like, the social mass of labor time, the social mass of labor, and the determination of the value of individual commodities is their aliquot part, their derived part socially necessary to make that particular thing. And that will be determined by the availability of technology, the availability of raw materials, and so on and so forth. Of course, surplus value is not exactly the same as profit, but I'll talk about the distinction between profit and surplus value a bit later on. because of course you also have to take into account, um, um, for example, machinery, tools, and all the rest of it also confer a proportion of their value to the finished commodity. So whilst it's the exploitation of human labor, only human labor contributes to the new value. The value of, say, a machine or a hammer or a chisel also imparts a proportion of their value to the finished product as it wears out, as it were. And so we can then, but we'll come on to that later and talk in terms. So we talk about constant capital and variable capital. Variable capital being that which is spent on the acquisition of labor power, constant capital for the acquisition of machinery and tools and means of production and so on. But we'll leave that for another session. Oh, you've frozen again. Is it just me? Hello? Can you hear me? Ah, oh, what's happened? Hello, Pamela. I think you're the host, but you're muted at the moment.
Oh, hello, Ian. Yeah, that was really terrific explanation of everything. So my question is about how we understand the shift from to globalization, the shift of the production of stuff, which Marx was talking about. So that has now increasingly shifted to the lower cost countries of the world, the ex-colonies, etc. And of course, yeah, China is part of this huge cheapening of the costs of production. So how would we incorporate and explain the service economy? Because as I understand it, the service economy contributes to human beings and in human existence. But I suppose, sort of thinking about that, what has also accompanied this globalization shift is a massive expansion of financial products, hedge funds, and all that sort of thing. I mean, maybe you're going to discuss that more in future programs. But yeah, so I was just sort of wondering how we should understand and describe that process.
That's a superb question and vitally important. Globalization is the ultimate development of capitalist relations on a in a sense. Capitalism has always been global. Capitalism has always had imperialism at its heart. That is to say, the extraction of a surplus from other societies. And in the context of what's going on at the moment, the idea of exporting industrial jobs overseas to China, to Korea, to Japan, and so on, partly it's explained by the fact that, of course, you can realize super profits because what you can then do is combine this notion around absolute and relative surplus value. So if the commodities that it takes to feed and clothe and provide all the other things that people need in China are considerably less, you're increasing the relative surplus value. So the Chinese worker doesn't need to work for as long to be equal to the necessary labor time. And on top of that, of course, in many developing countries, the super exploitation takes the form of a combination between that and absolute surplus value, so they can have the working day extended as well. And so you can see people working under very difficult conditions in so clothing extremely cheap to produce in Bangladesh, and it explains why you get this kind of why imperialism, therefore, is an absolutely crucial part of the development of capitalism that we see today. So as regards services, as opposed to, for example, the making of physical commodities, at one point, I think Marx talks about a service really is only one where production and consumption are simultaneous. In a sense, even the circus clown is a productive worker insofar as they enrich the circus owner. I could, for example, invest in a domestic servant to cook to prepare my meal, and that, in a sense, is one use of money, but that's not capital in a sense. I'm just using part of my income to pay for a domestic servant to cook me dinner. Instead, I could use the money I've got to invest in a restaurant and employ a chef to cook meals that I can then sell to people as paying customers. A service industry is no less productive from that point of view than that which one is producing things like shoes or watches or whatever else. There is a distinction to be drawn really with, for example, banking. I mean, if you consider the schema I put up, where I put MC, M prime, so the capitalist comes along with money, buys a commodity and sells it for more money. In a sense, what the banker does is cut out that middle commodity production. From that point of view, you come along with money and you end up with more money. So the banker, for example, lends money to the capitalist for investment and then charges an interest on the loan. From that point of view, some parts of the capitalist economy are clearly parasitic, and finance capital falls into that role. It doesn't mean to say, of course, it's not absolutely vital to the normal operation of capitalist relations, but it produces no new value. And moreover, what we can see is operating as part of the imperialist organization of capitalism to extract part of the surplus from the working population elsewhere in the world. We don't need to send an army to occupy India anymore, or more accurately, send British officers to use Indian soldiers to control India. Instead, it can be done through the banking system. And so all over the world, vast areas of the world owe vast amounts of money, often for capital products, capital projects, to Western imperial banks in imperialist countries. Does that answer the question? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, things like the health system and the education system, which contribute to the worker, I mean, that would be just part of the costs of the work, costs of production of that worker.
Absolutely. And from that point of view, and that's very important, because in the past, some Stalinist interpreters have tried to say, well, the only way you can be a real worker is if you're producing surplus value. From the point of view of Marx, of course, productive labor is that which produces surplus value. But of course, without a health service, without education and all those other things, and they, in a sense, are all part of that social wage. If you didn't have a state health system, there would be a private health system, and the wage of the worker would have to be adjusted accordingly. Or, as in the case of the United States, you get an absolutely terrible health outcome, despite the fact that they spend the biggest part of their gross domestic product on health than any other country in the world, because of course millions of people don't have any healthcare whatsoever. So that which might look like not productive work from the point of view of not producing surplus value, like the NHS, for example, is in fact part of that huge mass of social labor, and effectively ends up being part of the worker's wage.
It wasn't a qualitative judgment, was it? The distinction between productive and unproductive, quite the opposite.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a moral judgment.
Yeah. Steve, please. You have to unmute yourself, comrade. Can't quite hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Done it?
Yep.
Yeah, I am. Now, I may have been preempted by, was it Yeaman, Miss Yeaman? Oh, Maria Yeaman, because I was going to talk about Keynes. I've opened up her link, but I haven't read it. But I would just like to get your take on the multiplication effects of money, which was employed during the Depression in the US with all these public works projects. And now that I think of it, you know, how Reagan was planted in the White House and his brief was to undo the New Deal. And yet his father worked for one of those agencies. I don't know if it's the National Works Project or something like that. And the wages that he made helped to keep the family together during the Depression. And it's also why Keynes kind of discouraged. I'm not sure what I'm talking about here, so correct me if I'm wrong. I think he discouraged saving because, you know, say I go to a restaurant once a week, but then I decide to, instead of doing that, I'll save that money, you know, put £10 a week away instead of going to this restaurant. Because if everybody followed suit, then those restaurant workers will end up being unemployed and the place will shut down. So that's about it. I just wanted to get your take on it. Okay.
Thank you. Keynes is vitally important. It's vitally important to understand the role of Keynes, particularly in the period after the Second World War. But of course, John Maynard Keynes was present at Versailles, and he was highly critical of Versailles Treaty. He regarded the destruction of the German economy as an act of self-harm by the rest of the Allied countries, and therefore, I mean, Keynes knew whose side he was on. I've always thought there's a kind of a similarity in a sense between the sociologist Max Weber and John Maynard Keynes in seeing the importance of maintaining capitalism and maintaining certainly the appearance of progress, of rationally managing capitalism to the best effect. He could see that without some kind of central intervention, that chaos could ensue. In mentioning the New Deal, it makes the point very well that by, for example, having public works, by investing in technology, and of course the same happens today. Despite all the kind of protestations of neocons of one sort or another, the state still plays an absolutely crucial role. For example, in research and development, in providing a guaranteed market. Just to take one example, the COVID vaccinations, which are so fantastically helpful, wouldn't easily have come about without direct state intervention, both as an investor in research and technology and as a guaranteed purchaser of the products at the end of it. But it's always worth remembering something else about Keynes. As I say, he knew whose side he was on, and it wasn't the proletariat. Jeremy Corbyn really was little more than a left Keynesian, if one can use the term left, somewhat loosely. And from that point of view, the idea that the state plays a role in managing capitalism is central to John Maynard Keynes. And of course, that's really where Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and I dare say Bernie Sanders could be said to be the same. The idea that the state should play a role, for example, in taking the rough edges off of capitalism, so that people don't die for the want of medical care or whatever else. And in so doing, help to prolong capitalism by having a state-funded healthcare system. You provide, for example, a guaranteed market for private pharmaceutical industries to make super profits. You ensure a healthy workforce. And I'm not just saying in terms of a kind of functionalist argument where, yes, we need a healthy workforce. After all, during the Boer War, 1899 to 1903, half of the volunteers for the British Army weren't fit enough to be shot. They had to be turned away. So there was a deeply understood need for a healthy workforce. Average life expectancy I remember it made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, really, when I read it in Capital. Marx used to spend an awful lot of time reading the reports of Her Majesty's inspectorates of factories. And in the 1830s, average life expectancy in Liverpool had dropped to 15. So the working class wasn't actually living long enough to reproduce itself. But the Industrial Revolution didn't falter because, of course, we could suck in hundreds of thousands of Irish workers. So Keynes played a crucial role, I think, in helping the stability in the period after the Second World War, in terms of establishing welfare states that help maintain, and of course, it found its real expression in the programs to rebuild the German economy, rebuild the British economy in the period after the Second World War.
Would you say, though, on that subject, Ian, that Keynes is that idea, that the state has to fund all of these things, is very much a sign of crisis, and a sign of that there is an alternative, no matter how corrupted it was, but the existence of the Soviet Union and the red thread, etc., especially in Germany, played a crucial role, perhaps, in capitalism turning to Keynes, would you say?
Absolutely. I undoubtedly, without the possibility of socialism, and here I'm not arguing that the Soviet Union was socialist, but without the possibility of socialism, those concessions would never have been made. And so what you got in the period after the Second World War, particularly in the United States, was a period of unparalleled expansion in the standards of living of American workers, and to a certain extent in Britain too. Largely on the basis, of course, of the state management of coal mines, which would otherwise, for example, have collapsed and as wholly unprofitable, and the same was true of the railways. So, and to prevent the possibility of workers taking power for themselves, it was necessary to create the conditions for example, full employment, for social insurance, and the various things that were often attributed to the USSR. There was no unemployment. The fact that people's lives were pretty tough was neither here nor there, but there was no unemployment. There was a guaranteed job and so on. So those concessions had to be made or face the possibility of a restive proletariat.
I mean, before COVID, I would have said that it's almost impossible that under current capitalism, which is, there's no real threat from below, there's no USSR, etc. I would have thought it's almost impossible that the capitalist class would voluntarily turn to a form of Keynesianism, but we did see something like that, as you mentioned, anyway, during COVID. So quickly, when they have to, they can, and it's not totally impossible to imagine something similar happening, perhaps on the climate change front. that, although at the moment it looks like, because it's not profitable, etc., capitalism is built on growth and expansion, etc. But if something serious, more serious than already, something could be done, albeit not on our terms and not a democratic solution.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the absurd decision on the part of Rishi Sunak's government to continue to exploit North Sea oil to its logical conclusion, we can't afford to burn the stuff, so why extract it? At some point, one would have thought that some kind of sense would prevail. It doesn't look like it at the moment. The other thing is we're increasingly heading towards a war economy. And that's a worrying feature. And it's also a feature. If we take for something like the National Health Service, what's often overlooked is the fact that it was effectively nationalised during the First World War. All the old voluntary hospitals and the poor law institutions and the asylums were effectively taken in under state administration to house the large numbers of war wounded. The fact that it was returned to the preceding unsatisfactory requirements up until the Second World War, and then the whole thing was effectively nationalised even before the creation of the health service in 1948. And Beveridge, of course, was a liberal. He wasn't a socialist. So the idea that Anara and Bevan did it all single-handedly out of a socialistic love of free health.
A bit of his heart, yeah.
But I think that we're moving into a war economy. They treated COVID like a war. You just borrow unlimited money or just simply print as much money as you like. This is one of the features, of course, of fiat money. It's limitless. So far from there being a magic money tree, it's just a constant press of, produce as much money as you like.
With the Marx and Engels, I think it was with them or Lenin, I'm not sure, who coined the term of Kriegssozialismus. There is a form of socialism, but in order to, go to war, a war socialism, which has actually nothing to do with socialism. It's, a bit like National Socialism in Germany. It's the opposite of it, but it is the state in charge and the state suddenly, doing all the things that they said before they can't possibly do. And suddenly they are finding money for this and this, but of course for their purpose. But this is interesting because also Marx and Engels, of course, argued against various socialisms that had nothing to do with socialism, be it utopian socialism or, there's the whole range of them.
Yes. But it's another one of those features where if you, just as we talked about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you start to see the basis for capitalism growing within inside feudalism. The climate crisis is a perfect case in point where without planning, without some kind of central direction away from the market to simply say, stop burning the stuff. It's not as if they hadn't known. They've known for decades that this was happening. And the oil companies bent over backwards to suppress every piece of information to the effect that they were destroying the planet.
Absolutely. And getting back to your point about dialectics, this is quite important, isn't it? Everything that comes into being has to end at some stage. Your capitalism will have to end one way or another. It's not natural. It's not been there all the time. It will have to come an end. The question is very much how, and if it's done on progressive terms, on our terms, democratically, or if we fuck up the planet and destroy humanity.
And how many of us it'll take with it. I mean, it's already a bloodbath. Therefore, I mean, I don't think many people would be opposed to socialism once they knew what it was, rather than associate it with either the Soviet Union or Keynesianism, for that matter. The idea of a freely associating producers, all production to meet human need, direct participative democracy. No one's against it. They just either don't think it's possible because of human nature, or they think they won't let us. Any attempt to take power will be such a bloodbath as to make it not worth our while. But it's already a bloodbath. you know.
Absolutely. Before I bring in Anthony on this question, I mean, can you explain again your opposition to, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work? Sounds good, isn't it? Or fair distribution of wealth among the people. A lot of socialists, Jeremy Corbyn probably believes in that.
Yeah, well, fairness, who says? It presupposes that the existing relations of production remain untouched.
Right.
So a fair day's pay means what? A slightly larger proportion of the surplus, but it's haggling over the rate at which workers are exploited rather than arguing for the end of its exploitation. And socialism, as we see, is really got nothing whatsoever to do with the rate of pay. You can have very well paid workers who are still being exploited, whose lives are still wretched because of the nature of capitalism. And therefore, it's not a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, but the abolition of the wages system that we need to be fighting for. I mean, we could start with a progressive reduction in the working week. You could actually have a necessary working week of no more than about 10 hours. And if I only had to work 10 hours a week, would I really care what I did? I don't mind going down the drains if someone's got to go, so long as I can then develop myself in any way I please. So a fair day's work for a fair day's pay is always one of those kind of reactionary kind of things about haggling over the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table rather than taking over the bakery.
Exactly. It's about who owns the means of production, isn't it? And not just owns them, because nationalization is not the answer either. We don't want Rishi Sunak to decide everything. We want to run it. So it's ownership and control of the means of production has to be in the hands of the working class. And then I think actually 10 hours might even be a very conservative guess. If we develop the means of production, you could probably do a couple of hours a week, and then the rest of the time we, develop ourselves and run society, don't we? That's going to be a bigger job, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we could reforest vast areas of the world to deal with the climate crisis, but of course that's not going to be done because there's no money in it. I mean, yes, there's some people can make some money out of forestry, but it's capitalism has a tendency to go for the immediate realization of profits, and so the idea that a vast reforestation for the sake of protecting the environment makes no sense from a capitalist point of view, but it makes perfect sense from a human point of view.
Yeah, I also like that you pointed out that nature has value, and nature creates surplus value as well, which is some on the left don't see, but it is very important that it actually does. Okay, Anthony.
Can you hear me now?
It's very crackly. I hope it'll get better. Maybe put the microphone in a bit more.
How do you do that?
I don't know. There should be a cable. Yeah, let's try.
I'll try my best. But in my brief remarks tonight, I want to talk about the state of capitalism, both with the worker states and the colonial world. Because capitalism is dying on its feet. You look at the economic crisis, the banks are in terrible mess. I mean, the banks could collapse anytime without me stayed in the last few months. We also have to there's some movement in this debate over Stalinism and the worker states historically in the Soviet Union. It would be wrong to have illusion in Stalinism, but we also have to recognise that Putin says an alternative society. And that alternative society is in China, which has lifted 400 people out of poverty, which has traded with the third world, with bargaining with imperialism to undermine imperialism in the third world. But the problem is with the blocks is using the third world as a bargaining chip with imperialism in order to bargain and make deals, and he says on principle alliance with the capitalists with the third world with an overthrowing them. And Russia is in a life and death clash battle in Ukraine to stop capitalist restoration. But this thing about war socialism is very dangerous concept, because that's how the Social Democrats justify supporting imperialist war efforts. In fact, they're fighting for imperialism and world markets. The worker state is not the same as that, because they've overthrown capital despite separatism mostly being Stalinized. Obviously, when they started trading with China in the market, the capitalists had inroads, millions were laid off. But now, because the political revolution in Tiananmen Square, they had to make concessions to the Roxy. They couldn't rule in the same way. So this led to concessions on they bought them up for the material concessions that has actually taken place. But the American Socialist Workers' Party documents are worth reading against the Chapmanites, understanding the dual nature of Stalinism and all the contradictions which takes place. I mean, I remember in The Guardian they were saying Britain pioneered the railways. China produced more roads than anywhere in the world. Obviously, we need the war revolution to be extended. The political revolution is a key concept in that regard. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, sorry, comrade, it's very crackly. I hope Ian understood more than
I did, and some very important points. I'd like to answer them. There's so much there. Forgive me if I go through it briefly. So where to start? China. Okay, let's start with China. You're absolutely right to say that in China, millions have been lifted out of poverty. That's absolutely true. What you've seen is a huge development in the forces of production in the context of China, but not in socialist terms. You know, it may well, some people may well want to say that if you like, the gain of the Chinese Revolution was to effectively hasten capitalism. That wasn't the intention, but nevertheless, with the reversion of China to a bizarre form of capitalism, and that's the important thing. It's we're going through we're living in a time in which capitalism is in decline, but it's at the moment impossible to supersede it. China has indeed developed the forces of production, and millions, as you say, have been lifted out of absolute poverty, in the sense that they're not subsistence farmers reliant upon rice or whatever else. And that is to be welcomed, in the sense that the proletariat now is bigger than it has ever been. But what we've now also got, of course, is the basis for an inter-imperialist rivalry between the world hegemon, the USA, and China. And what we can see, of course, is the Ukraine war is being used as a proxy war against Russia. And it's tempting to conclude that that's just the first step. Once Russia is reduced to being a dependency of the USA, then the next step will be to take on China. Now, I don't imagine for one moment that will involve the invasion of China, a full-scale world war, a full-scale war in the form of like in the Second World War, but that it will take an economic form, and it may well take the form of millions of deaths if there is a fight, for example, over Taiwan. I mean, I don't regard the Soviet Union having been I don't regard it as having been socialist, and moreover, it was an impediment to the development of the possibility of socialism. One could argue that Hitler would never have come to power without Stalin's help, without, for example, the absurdity of the description of the SPD as being social fascists, and therefore helping to divide the German working class against the possibility of preventing Hitler coming to power. And quite apart from anything else, of course, Stalin had effectively developed a model of society where socialism was also associated with authoritarianism. It's not accidental that Hitler used a red flag, or that the SR used a more explicitly anti-capitalist rhetoric than Hitler himself. In the term war communism, Tina, I don't think was defending it. She was simply making a point that under certain circumstances, even the capitalist class will turn to something, as we saw with COVID. It had to be centralized. It had to be state directed. What it wasn't, of course, was directed by us, the proletariat. I'm afraid I don't know anything about the American SWP, and the banks, I think, is crucial. That you mentioned the great banking crises that we've seen in relatively recent years are not the last, and we've seen the chaos that it has caused, and ultimately, of course, that fiat money, which is not really a reflection of the productivity of a society. It is not a reflection of the social product. And therefore, what you see is once these banks are engaged in what amounts to an enormous Ponzi scheme collapse, then the only basis then is for real value to recapitalize the banks. And that's exactly what happened to us, isn't it? You had the privatization of profits, but the nationalization of the losses. So we picked up the tab effectively on a global scale. And it's not the last time we'll see that.
No. Thank you. And thanks, Anthony. Mark, please.
Yeah, good evening. A few things. I suppose it's how advanced are the working class at this current times. I think very few workers read Marx. That's the reality of it, sadly. It's often seen as very complex. But like today, I was doing a talk to some, they're basically branch organisers across Unite in the North, basically making an appeal for some funds towards a documentary piece, which I'll help produce so I can get the monies together to pay the directors and people like that. And they'd watched the little film that we put together on Halifax 1842 before I'd turned up. It's half an hour piece. And when I asked them what they thought about it, they said, well, and I was a bit shocked. They goes, well, it's a bit like today, isn't it? So that's 181 years later. And 182 years later, and they recognise that the workers under what was like starting to be, or was industrial capitalism, that they were in the same situation. Machinery could often replace workers very quickly. Their pay could be driven down at any particular period. Obviously, they're not as poorly off as people were in the 1840s, but there was an immediate recognition that they were of the same class, the same people. Obviously, I pointed out E.P. Thompson's book, the Making of the English Working Class, and said, look, you really should read this book. And certainly a couple of them, I'm sure, are going to go and get the books. The question of it's a sort of couple of questions, basically. During Brexit or during Lexit, many of the left in this country campaigned for a Lexit. I mean, they never managed any, as far as I know, across the North, Lexit managed not a single meeting in a working class community outside of Sheffield. Not one on any working class estate did they manage. So they had no support whatsoever. And my friends, some of my friends who are Noah Farage, for example, when I asked them and I pointed out to them that there was a left campaign to leave Europe, they laughed. They thought it was just utterly ridiculous, and basically said this is a right-wing project. The left will never make any inroads on such an idea. When I challenged people on the left about this, there was a belief that by Britain coming out of the European Union, it would be one step towards one nation socialism. And that appears now to have, in a loose way, although nobody's brave enough actually to step up, particularly and continue to argue that there is a motive towards the modern monetary theory, which is basically, in my view, a futile idea that we could spend our way to socialism. We could print as much money as we possibly can. So I'd be interested in Ian's views on MMT in particular. Thanks for your time.
Yeah,
That's a whole session itself, but
yeah,
let's give it a go.
we should do it, and I think we should probably do it as a separate session, but because I think it'd be fascinating. I mean, my attitude towards Lexit was that it was just foolish. I mean, people like Tariq Ali would have thought would know better. but Tariq Ali supported it. And, one of my earliest political acts when I joined the YCL 50 years ago was the first referendum, and of course the Communist Party of Great Britain then was in favour of leaving because of the absurdity of a notion of socialism in one country. By contrast, then the IMG, as a Trotskyist organisation, was in favour of a socialist United States of Europe. A socialist United States of Europe would be a step in the right direction, in my opinion. How can one conceive of socialism in one country? I think it's interesting, of course. Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn, and many others on what passed for the left within the Labour Party were effectively quite close to what is now the Communist Party of Britain, the Morning Star. I mean, Corbyn used to routinely write for the Morning Star, I think still does. And the idea that you could have, for example, socialism in one country, the British road to socialism, the capitalist class will destroy that within weeks. If a country the size of the Russian Empire can't build socialism in one country, then what's Britain's chances? And of course, in the case of Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn, there was this sort of romantic idea that somehow the sovereignty of Westminster could bring about something socialistic. Maybe not socialism, but something a bit like Sweden, Finland, or something. But really, that was as far as it went, as far as I could see. It's certainly got nothing to do with what Marx was arguing for. I mean, Marx and Engels were very much in favour of German unification, not because they wanted more power to go to Kaiser Wilhelm, but because they wanted to see ultimately the end of the nation state. They could see that it was a progressive step in terms of the development of the forces of production within Germany, and therefore supported it. But that doesn't mean to say they supported Germany's imperial ambitions. I mean, when it came to France attacking Germany in 1870, they were totally opposed to Louis Napoleon. Once Louis Napoleon had gone and the Commune had been declared, they were on the side of the French workers in Paris. The position that one takes with regard to these entities is dependent upon the balance of forces on a class basis. I can't see under what circumstances the proletariat of Britain or any other part of Europe has gained from Brexit at all. And the fact that people like Tariq Ali, I mean, it had a romantic kind of attachment to it, didn't it? After all, we saw the way in which the European Union treated Greece, and you could see why some people, but no one on the left who was using their brain would say they were in favour of the European Union or anything other than the European Union was there to serve the interests of the ruling class, which is undoubtedly true. And Westminster's not, so from my point of view, the aim was, I voted to stay firmly in the European Union because I want to see ultimately the end of the nation state in all its forms.
What about MMT then?
MMT, sorry?
Modern monetary theory, or do you rather give that a miss?
I don't really know enough to comment on it, to be perfectly honest.
Thanks, Mark. I think it falls in the same category as redistribution, be fairer and more justice, and print more money, but while leaving the means of production in the hands of the capitalists, basically. But I'm not an expert on it either.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And to sum up, comrade, perhaps because we've got no more question, we've got a question in the Q&A, and I'll quickly summarize it. The comrade, I think Julian, is asking about a range of questions to do with alienation, marriage. He was quite taken with your quick comment on Engels not getting married because he didn't believe in that property relationship, etc. Marx, of course, did get married. So is there something you could extrapolate from that on alienation generally? Also on religion, could it be said they were talking about cultural religions? Certainly Christianity, for example, models forms of the commune, certainly in the Book of Acts, and it has a high regard for the needs of the oppressed. And that's not going to be your summing up, because we've just had 2 more people with their hands up. So, but maybe you got 1 or 2 things to say. Well, I'll make these comrades into panelists if you can still keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not attacking people who are married or attacking the institution of marriage. I'm on my second one myself, so the point about it is that this is a feature of how contractual forms express themselves rather than in direct and personal ways. And again, religious ideas often express socialistic ones. I mean, not only in the ancient world, but of course more recently. And I mentioned, for example, Gerard Winstanley in the English Revolution talking of the sin of private property, and in the commune at St. George's Hill. All people possessing all products in common, and the means of production in common there. But of course, that could only ever be something that would be swept away, because there wasn't the social basis for generalizing that beyond. Yeah, okay. So yeah, there are lots of Christian socialists, many of whom I've been good comrades and worked alongside, and very happy to do so. I'm not, and even if you look at the Marx family directly, Eleanor Marx famously embraced her Jewish heritage, learned Yiddish so that she could help organize among workers in the East End of London, among Jewish workers in the rag trade, and regarded and described herself as a Jewess. So, I'm certainly not hostile to religion either.
I could argue that Jesus, in whichever form he or they existed, was a revolutionary, not a communist, but a communistic revolutionary.
The magnificent thing about the Bible, of course, is that it does have lots of human interpretations. It is a human document, and notions like it is easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, I think, has a real resonance. However, it's the same Bible that it takes chattel slavery for granted.
Yeah, different parts written obviously by different people for different reasons.
Absolutely, it is not univocal. So lots of different documents brought together at different times for different reasons.
But it's a very human document for sure, not a very godly one. Cheryl, and your cat. Hi.
Cat. Yeah, it's a bit off topic, but it's I just wondered what you thought about this. I've been in quite a few Twitter spaces with young people, and they seem to think like Bitcoin is the way to is almost kind of revolutionary in itself as a way of getting around capitalism. I just thought it was quite an interesting idea. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but it seems to be quite popular with young people as a way to try to kind of challenge capitalism in a way, because Bitcoin doesn't work through banks and everything. I don't know. I just wondered what you thought of it. I just thought it was quite an interesting idea, but quite a popular one amongst certain young people.
Yeah, I think it's a Ponzi scheme that will fail. What's the relationship to the total sum of social production? It reminds me almost of the South Sea bubble or something. Eventually, it'll come crashing down. I don't know enough about it really to comment in any serious way. But as far as I can see, there have been other cryptocurrencies that have collapsed with catastrophic results, and it's only a matter of time. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is. But the only thing I would say for it, and I'm more interested, I suppose, in the disappearance of cash than I am in the arrival of Bitcoin, is that sooner or later you get to a position where cash becomes kind of meaningless. I mean, I very rarely ever carry the stuff now. And once money just becomes a series of electronic transactions in that way, it is a useful step on the road to saying, well, we'll do away with money completely, or have a completely different basis for it. Marx, in the Critique of the Gotha program, for example, talked about the idea of replacing money with labor certificates. But you have to read it in the context of the time. I mean, he's talking about, the worker would get, say they do their 10 hours of necessary labor. They could then take their labor certificate and go and take whatever they wanted from the common storehouse. Charming idea. And these are labor certificates. They don't circulate like money. You just exchange your embodied labor time in your labor certificate, and you go and help yourself to what you want. I mean, Marx didn't do blueprints. It was one of the few places where he actually just, ventured a suggestion as to what something like, and it might have made sense at the time. I could certainly see a situation where, so well, so long as you do a certain amount of necessary labor time, because after all, people with dementia still need to be looked after, trains still need to be cleared, and so on. Why shouldn't you help yourself to whatever you need, really? How many televisions can you watch? I could have 6 of them. There'd still be nothing on there worth watching. But on the other end, a media controlled by people who are genuinely creative and not doing it for commercial reasons might actually produce a real flourishing in culture in all sorts of ways, and not just televisions.
But on that quickly, Ian, I mean, money is not the root of all evil, is it? I mean, you could have class society without money, and you did for a long time, and it's not, it's about 3,000 years old, money at a stretch. I mean, if we abolished, or somebody abolished money, it could still have a form of capitalism, wouldn't you?
I mean, there would be a transitional period, I think, where for a while you would need some means, because there will be some things there will always be a scarcity of, like villas on the Adriatic or whatever. But most things, because of there is already abundance. That precondition for socialism has already been reached. There is already abundance. You could, in a position, get rid of money fairly quickly, I would have thought.
But it's not the money. I mean, it's not money that leads to capitalism, is it? It's an expression. Money is an expression that you need to run capitalism.
It just in the same way that you don't abolish religion, the conditions for religion vanish. So the conditions for money vanish. If you're not producing commodities anymore, if you're producing solely use values to meet human need, and that's your sole objective, then the basis for money starts to disappear.
Thank you. William, sorry, go on. No. Finish your sentence, sorry.
No, so I've finished. That's okay.
Hi, William.
Hi. Right, I'm getting back to Mary Bones, Engels' common law wife, as you call her. I'm sure he called her his life partner. Now, Mary Bones came from a communist background. There's those who will tell us that it was a primitive communist background, but the more you study it, the more you realize it was a very advanced communist background. Now, there's those who tell us that Mary Bones wasn't Mary Bones at all because she didn't spell her name right. That's because Mary Bones was highly educated in a system that didn't use literacy as part of the educational system. It was all purely oral, and it was highly advanced oral lectures that she would have attended. Now, we're all part of our ancestry. So Mary Bones would have been born in the 1820s. Her mother would have been born in the 1790s or 80s, and then her grandmother would have been born in the 1750s or 30s, and that would have been a whole nearly 100 years of education that she would have been born into. Now, this is why there has never been an academic study done on the influence that Mary Burns had over Engels, but Engels was very much engrossed with her. And the more you study it, the more you realize that he was. She came from a background where, first of all, property didn't exist. It was held communally by the clan system. And that's how he understood when he was. She was his main source of critique when he was doing his study of the origins of the family. The origins of the family in Celtic times was not based on property because property didn't exist. The clan owned the property, it was communally held. And maybe then as the system fell down because of the British colonials, the Irish then were driven out of Ireland by genocide. And most of them ended up in Britain, but an awful lot of them ended up in America, which is the only reason why we're still talking about the genocide, because it wasn't successful. It was only half successful. It was totally successful in Scotland with the Celtic nation in Scotland. And therefore you don't hear anything about it. But if you walk around the Highlands of Scotland like I did, you will find hamlets and deserted hamlets everywhere you go. And you'll say to yourself, what kind of a civilization? I'm only talking about the 1840s and the 1860s in Scotland. But in Ireland, no. Now, when they shifted the people out of Ireland to work in the industries and fill the gap, as you said, the life expectancy after the British feudal system fell down and the people became proletariats as opposed to serfs, the life expectancy was 15. Well, that vacuum was filled by migrant Irish labour who were not English speakers. And that allowed racism. The Irish were supposed to be thick and stupid. They spoke backwards. That's because they had a different grammar. Like in Irish, if you were calling a small boy, you wouldn't say small boy. You'd say búgal beag, which means boy small. So when they directly translate, or when they express themselves in a new language, they could very well be using the grammar of the old language. And this, of course, they were left as inferior. Now, Mary Burns was clearly a big influence on Engels. And maybe some British academics could start doing a bit of research on poor old Mary Burns. But the more I go into it, the more I find her a fascinating person. Now, he lived with her sister after she died, but she died prematurely at around 45 years of age. Marx, who I don't consider to be as strong a communist as Engels. I think Engels was more grassroots and down to earth. He actually insulted Engels' second partner, Mary Burns' sister. So much so, and you can research it in the British Museum, because he sent a letter to Engels saying, "Yeah, after getting rid of one dirty Irish bitch, and now you're marrying another one." Now that's not verbatim. That's precisely what he was saying. So much so that Engels told him that if he insulted the women that he loved, he wouldn't be getting any more. He wouldn't be getting finance anymore. And with his drinking habits, he needed a hell of a lot of finance. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, William.
The only thing I have to add about Mary Burns is that she clearly had a crucial role to play in Engels' writing of the condition of the working class in England. She was his principal informant. She led him through the streets of Salford and Manchester, and it was the writing of the condition of the working class in England that impressed Marx so much that because the first time they met, they didn't get on terribly well because he associated him with kind of young Hegelians. But it was that book that really impressed Marx and was the beginning, really, of their relationship. He was terribly rude about even Mary Burns at times, and quite crass. I'm not sure I would have liked Marx as a human being. I think I would have got on with Engels much nicer, better. But you don't have to like Marx to appreciate his genius.
No. Mary Burns brought Engels around Ireland twice. Once previous to the famine, and once after, during the famine. And he would have needed her because at that stage, the Irish, 75% of Ireland still spoke Gaelic. It was the famine that killed the Irish language, or had a major hand in killing the Irish language. So we would have needed her in order to be able to converse with the ordinary people.
Thanks, William. And thanks, Ian. This is an interesting subject that we'll also be revisiting in a special session of the Communist Culture Club on May the 2nd for May Day, Communism of the Past and Communism of the Future. And we'll be certainly be looking at things like the clan system, which existed, as William says, right up to 19th, 20th century, even in some parts. And I also recommend comrades read Rosa Luxemburg's Introduction to Political Economy, which is very readable. And she very interestingly describes as colonialism spreads through the world, you get all these reports of, oh, there's a system, there's a village, and there's tons of villages where everything is held in common, and there, and in Russia, and in Ireland, and in Germany, and there, and suddenly it turns out it's not just isolated cases, but it's something that existed throughout history and was still existing in many parts. And interesting also to notice that Marx and Engels didn't call it primitive communism, as Ian said, but Urkommunismus, which means original communism, which is a much better way of looking at it. So thanks very much, Ian. That was a really good session I think if we sum it up in one sentence, perhaps it's, capitalism is not natural, and it comes and it must go. And the question is, how does it go? It could go in a number of ways, and we have to make sure it goes in the democratic, progressive way, i.e. the working class takes over, and abolishing money or MMT, all these justice, social justice, etc., are shortcuts, or supposed shortcuts that don't go to the root of the problem that Marx and Engels quite clearly identified in what we looked at today, i.e. we need to take hold of the means of production, and why that is so they explained with their theory of profit and surplus value, etc. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, comrades, for a really interesting discussion and productive discussion. I hope to see you next week at the Communist Culture Club. Bye-bye, comrades.